Hello and welcome to our fifth episode of the DEI is podcast. With me today is our very special guest, Erin-Kate Escobar. Erin-Kate Escobar Consulting has a vision where people are able to navigate, the challenge oppression as whole humans. They work to accomplish that through their mission to build more inclusive workplaces where people can thrive through developing and implementing DEI strategies that include healing and anti-racist practices. Erin-Kate has previously developed DEI initiatives in STEM communities, including Caltech, NASA, and Nobel Prize-winning LIGO scientific collaborations. These days, you can more often find them partnering with small businesses, museums, schools, and nonprofits to create more diverse and equitable team environments. Erin-Kate navigates the world as a non-binary, queer, Latinx, white, multi-ethnic, and non-Zionist Jewish person of color. And Erin-Kate is passionate about supporting personal growth and institutional social change towards greater equity. You can go to their website to be the first to know about their toolkit to build transformative employee resource groups in the workplace. Erin-Kate, how are you today?
Hi, it's really nice to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad that you could join us. And, just really looking forward to this episode. I always have such a fantastic time talking to you and just smiles all around. So, really excited to be amplifying your brand, your message, your everything, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us today about ERGs.
Yeah,
So, to kind of set the context here for us, what is an ERG and why are we seeing a resurgence of them in recent years?
totally. So, ERGs also go by many different names. So, they are employee resource groups, but they also go by business resource groups, affinity groups, um, clubs and organizations within a they have a lot of names. They're not new. They started in the 1960s around race and around like as a result of the discrimination in the workplace. And they've been shifting and changing over time to be expected in our workplaces, to be something that is of value. And I think there's been a really big shift in companies, organizations saying, if they haven't started them, saying we need to start them now, but feeling maybe overwhelmed with how many do we start? How do we cultivate the type of experience that we want within our company? How do we create this symbiotic relationship where this employee resource group both feels served by the company and listened to? And what are they getting out of this experience where they are adding so much value back to our organization?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, if we can kind of pivot to our audience really quick, what's your perception? Are ERGs here to stay, or are they another business trend? So, while we're waiting for those to come in, let's dive in here. So, as we've been talking about, we've seen a lot of ERGs being formed following the spike of interest in DEI. However, we've also seen with that kind of proliferation, a lot of complaints around the experience of belonging to an ERG. And sometimes this is related to like perhaps organizational dysfunction, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think as ERGs have grown or BRGs, there's a lot of challenges they can face because they are an organization functioning within an organization. Like you said, like the dysfunction is passed on. We see this in families, right? We see this in businesses. So we have to really be thoughtful about how we create an ERG that's going to challenge those very same systems of oppression that have created the organization to function in the way that it does. Which is a pretty big ask, which is why I created a toolkit to address that, right? Because we have to think about how an ERG, we don't want it to be used by the organization. Nobody wants to feel like another tool. We don't want them to be symbolic, like, look at this great ERG, aren't they happy? We want them to be actually, integrated into what we're doing with access to power, change, a place where like the feedback loop really gets heard. And so when we see organizations kind of create them and not think about how they need to be directly tied to power, money, influence, those important pieces, we start to see the frustration of, are we just being used? Is this just a symbol? How, if our company or organization's not listening to us? And then there's definitely the piece of like, a lot of us aren't taught leadership skills. They're handed down to us. There's something we develop over time, but there's some really thoughtful ways we can be a leader of a group in a way that does not reinforce the same systems of oppression, the same hierarchy we've come to know, that reinforces, I'd say, the lack of inclusion that we've been feeling. And so there is a piece of cultivating our own leadership development in those spaces for it to look different than every other meeting we might be attending.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really love those elements that you were talking about, right? So it's ERGs are a product of the organization, right? So there's a direct link there, right? So a lineage and a flow. And if things are not allowed to flow in nature, right, we know that they stagnate. And that's often when, bad stuff starts to happen. So if we're thinking about it as like kind of a body, it's not just something that you tack on to the outside. It's something that has to be a part of the whole self, right? And so I think that's really easy to miss. We've got a couple comments coming in, and I've been popping up some things on the screen, but for those who might be listening, there are several people who are super excited to have Erin-Kate here with us today and are responding to our audience questions. So Jake Small he's saying hashtag here to stay. There is a clear and apparent need for the ERG model in many industries. However, they need to continue to be dynamic and serve the new populace of workers. So speaking directly to what Erin-Kate is talking about, thank you so much, Jake. We've also got Sabrina A. Townsend chiming in. I think they are here to stay. However, some major employers have dismissed them. Yes. So I would say they have mixed reviews. Yeah, very much so, and very much the reason why we wanted to do this episode today. They do need funding, time, support from managers for employees to participate. They also need access to decision makers. Yes, thank you so much for those thoughts, Sabrina. Lanissa is also chiming in. I see a long-term need for ERGs, but until they're ready for the BRG level and an ability to show benefit and return on investment to the organization, they remain vulnerable. Lanissa, wonderful points to add to our conversation. Erin-Kate, would you like to respond to any of those?
Gosh. Well, I think the return on investment of ERGs or BRGs is a huge part of this conversation, because companies want to know that what they're investing in has returns. And there is some research done on this. There's some great groups doing some really thoughtful research that has shown and proves that when you invest in your employees' well-being, their employees continue to produce and do a really good job at their jobs.
Shocking news, everybody.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. I know that's revolutionary, because that's not what businesses were created to do, right? Businesses were created to get the most out of their workers. I have to remind people of this all the time. We didn't give people bathrooms, right? People had to ask for bathrooms. So people think they're asking for really basic things. And I'm like, that's great. We have to, because it wasn't created for us to be successful. This was created for our business to be successful. And now we're helping those businesses say, help me help you be successful. And the return on investment piece, I both say it's important as an ERG to be able to speak to that, but I also don't want that to be your primary job. We don't want our worth to be determined by whether or not we can prove why we need to be able to thrive in our workplaces. But I think there's some really beautiful relationship building that can happen between different departments within an organization to say, this is how we're going to support this. This is how we're going to look into measuring this, and thinking about the things that we measure for return on investment to be realistic, to not depend on our ERGs for all of the retention of our employees, but to be really thoughtful about what can this group actually contribute to and how important it can be for the success of our organization.
Yeah, definitely. We've got another comment coming in from Carolyn. Uh, Carolyn Moselle. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the middle name, so please do forgive me. But Carolyn says, my experience with a few client interactions lately has revealed the morale benefit has not kept up with the ROI or return on investment benefit. Yeah. Any thoughts there?
So I don't think that's the only purpose of ERGs. So if we're just saying they're here to keep the morale up, there's a lot more within our organizations we have to do to support employees than create a space for them to come together that's funded for their professional development, for them to be able to advocate, for them to build community with each other.
Yeah.
They can't, like you said, like they're not a feather in our hair or the hat on an outfit. They have to be integrated into the way that your organization works, consulted, brought in, and then in a lot of ways compensated, right? Mm-hmm. Because they are integral to how we're going to make decisions and how we're moving forward with things. So it's not enough to just, try to create a group that goes out for pizza and gets drinks after work. They really have to be within your organization, respected, given access to power, and then compensated at a level where it's clear they're contributing and it's valued.
Yeah, absolutely. Carolyn has followed up and says, I meant moral rather than morale. So please excuse me for putting you on the spot there, Carolyn. But nonetheless, I do think that was a great contribution to our discussion. So thank you. Spelling mistakes and all, happens to all of us. And magic of working live, I think. So if we're pivoting now a little bit, beyond just kind of having the desire to create space for different types of employees or people that identify differently or along various lines, if we're thinking about what makes an ERG functional, kind of like at its basic level, what or how to say, let me back up a little bit. So let's say that we've got our ERG up and running, right? And it's working, it's doing fine, but how do we take it to that kind of next level from merely functional to something that's really gonna change things?
Yeah. Well, some of the most important pieces of becoming a functional organization have to do with, I love this comment, compensated. They have to do with compensation, but it has to also do with when we lead how we are leading our ERG is about how it's going to show up in our organization. And so I've created a toolkit to try to help leaders of ERGs think about how do we challenge the dysfunction of leadership that we may have experienced and lead a group that looks different. And so that might look like challenging what hierarchy looks like. It looks like co-creating what we're going to do this year, not being assigned, we do an event a month, we do 3 meetings a month, and then we do an annual fill in the blank and a quarterly fundraiser. And the third piece is literally limiting how much an ERG does. And it's going to sound wild, but I've talked to so many people as I've researched for this toolkit through my work as a DEI consultant working with ERGs. And I talk to folks who are doing way too much. The number of events, meetings, programs, Heritage Month, days that are significant. I'm like, take a step back. I want you to focus on 3 things in your ERG. I want you to think about how are you building meaningful relationships, affinity. I want you to think about what are you advocating for? Not 120 things. Let's bring that list down to what are we advocating for this quarter, this year? What are we advocating for over the next 3 years? Because it's not going to happen overnight. It takes time. And then what do we need? What are the tools we need to professionally develop to be able to do our jobs and feel really good about what we're creating, what we're adding to, how we show up here. And that's like culturally competent professional development, not just we invite someone in to tell everyone how to function in the same way. It's helping people learn, what is my communication style? What's my leadership style, so that I can work with other people and continue to understand one another and how we function differently.
Erin-Kate, just reflecting here in the moment, what I'm loving about what you just said is, people often talk about creating space, and there's a lot of focus on that and a real need. That said, what I've most often observed is when people create space, immediately they want to fill it, you know? And what I'm hearing you say is, hang on a second, we need some room to spread out a little bit, stretch out, get a sense of how we're doing, our faculties, figure out what we need to do. And as we're doing that, let's not overburden ourselves so that we can actually be successful. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the
Nice.
key to DEI, right? Like, how are we slowing down? How are we not just recreating the same oppressive structures of too much work to do and not enough time? And saying, what do we really want to focus on? And I take people through exercises in this toolkit that help people really sink into, how do I do that on a personal level? And then how do I bring that to the ERG group that I'm a part of leading, so that we can do that together? I've had time to reflect. I want to give people in the group time to reflect. And then we come together to say, how do we co-create this so that it feels really good to show up here? And I'm excited about what we're working on. And I like the way that we're building relationships. We don't play hot seat, unless one person loves hot seat and they want to play that game, but it doesn't feel like I go and I'm scared of the icebreaker question.
All right. Yeah, sweating it.
But I want it to be meaningful too, and so much more than our ice cream flavors, which is an important part of building community. But also, let's really think about how can we build the type of relationships that are going to help us deepen. And I think in pandemic times, we've learned just how painful the surface questions can be, knowing that a how are you is a much more complex question than I'd say ever before, or we're acknowledging that it's more complex than ever before.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for just concretely breaking, everything down for us into those three things to kind of focus on. What I love to hear from our audience is, well, what are some clear indicators that an ERG is in trouble? So I think against the backdrop of what you've just been saying, Erin-Kate, that we might get some good answers. But yeah, certainly we've already started down that road a little bit. While we're waiting for those responses to come in, we've got a couple more comments. I got one here from Kevin D. Goodman. I love the discussion of boundary capacities. Ooh, I like that phrase. Focus goals and meaningful relationships over productivity for ERGs. Such an important perspective, counter to business as usual. Kevin, thank you so much for that thought. If we're moving into our next question, what are some concrete steps that someone who wants to start an ERG can take to set themselves up for success and to create something that is resilient to organizational, group, and individual stressors?
Yeah.
Big question. Big question.
Ooh, okay. Well, I have multiple answers for this, right? Because what first concrete step I want people to take is, how do you create space to feel rested and have boundaries in this process? I think people think about starting something new and they're like, woo, we got to do it all. And I'm going to have a million meetings a week about this. And then once it gets started, it's like popcorn, right? You pop a few kernels and it's just going to start exploding. And so I help people walk through a process of, how do I prioritize and think about, actually, how much time do I have to put into this? And create those boundaries on your schedule. So the really concrete step there is, literally, I tell people, take 15 minutes of your week and schedule it for, this is where I'm going to reach out to people who I'm hoping to partner with. And that is where, if emails come in, I let them know, I'll get back to you on Thursday when I have a little more time to look into this. that is my Thursday think time where I'm going to invest that time and energy in there, but to not allow it to be like a project that just takes over everything that we're doing. Because a really transformative part of forming a group is that you are taken care of. If you are leading this group, you have capacity to give from a place of, I have enough, which I know is a hard place to get to in our workplaces, but it doesn't have to be complete. It can just be like, enough is this 30 minutes I've set aside a week to work on employee resource group creation. And a huge concrete step in employee resource group creation is building relationships.
Yeah.
And so it is reaching out to people in different levels and different departments in our organizations. And it is thinking about how are we inviting them to the table to have this conversation with us, sharing how excited we are about what we're hoping this group is going to accomplish, and getting folks who want to join or support the creation of what we are advocating for, of what we're looking to create, so that it's really clear when we go to ask for, money out of this budget. It's really clear that it's going to benefit this group, and that is going to actually support this department, which is actually going to help us do better in the long run as an organization.
Yeah, I think, that also underscores the earlier point, which is if we are approaching ERGs with this business as usual mindset, then the results are going to be essentially the same. And just a reminder, ERGs are the opportunity for us to create space to rethink how we do work. So why would we do it in the same way? That said, it's very easy to do that, especially when we're really busy. So I think this point about boundaries is just well taken. So if we're thinking about metrics a little bit, right? So what kinds of things might you recommend people check on to make sure that things are going the way that they want them to?
Yeah. This is a great question. And like many of these questions, it really has to do with what the purpose of your group is, which is going to be different for many different employee resource groups. There's not one mission or vision statement out there that encompasses all of them. Mm-hmm. And so as you're forming this group, you really want to think about if what we're trying to accomplish is building community. We're not measuring our return on investment for, what our quarterly earnings are. But we can start to think about if the purpose of our group, if our vision and mission, how do we measure if we're successful at that? So if it's for professional development to be more accessible or access to mentoring to exist, then we're measuring that by creating a mentoring program and saying, how are people responding to that? Whether that's how many people are in the program, what are people's experience of that experience of mentorship? It could be, if we are focused on professional development, how many people are attending those sessions? But more than that, what are people taking away and how are they applying that knowledge from those spaces to what we do? And measuring that is a little bit harder than a yes or no question, right? Measuring that also takes time. Measuring that means it's not a one-time training that teaches us how to be empathetic. Like we are building empathy into our protocols and our policies and the way that we function. We learned from a workshop what empathy was, how it can exist in our workplace, and then there's 20 other initiatives coming from multiple other places, not just the ERG, that are reinforcing the importance of how that shows up in how we review people at the end of the year, how we manage, how we host meetings, and that it's not just 20 people came to this workshop on DEI terminology, and now we have 150 more employees who know DEI terminology because we know the terminology changes. And how does it matter? How does it engage in our process of how we're doing our work, and not just another thing that people feel overwhelmed by, doing to memorize some list of vocabulary.
Yeah, so part of what I'm hearing you say here is that we might have to, while our tendency at work might be to look towards more quantitative metrics, because of the nature of the work that we'll be doing in ERGs to make them really transformational, transformative, is perhaps more qualitative in nature, because ultimately it's about quality of life, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I do build in a whole chapter to this toolkit on like return on investment and using the language of your organization to talk about whether that's retention or turnover. To really think about how can you bring that into just how your group functions. You cannot be, an ERG cannot be responsible for employee turnover rates, but a employee resource group can think about what are we doing, what is the demographics and what does it look like within this group, and what's going on here. But the dysfunction of an organization may be showing up there too. So if people aren't showing up to those spaces because they don't have time and capacity, it's not rewarded, it's not seen as valuable, then we've just reinforced the same issue. And then we've said this ERG is here to prove differently. And we
Right.
haven't solved for the core root of the problem, which is people have too much work on their plate to be human, to stop and get a glass of water,
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, and just to go back to something very quickly that we were talking about earlier, when you were saying we have had to ask for things in organizations, I'd just like to remind everybody that we had to ask for the weekend, we had to ask for child labor laws, we had to ask for everything, and yet still today in 2022, cashiers at grocery stores are not allowed to sit down. So that should tell you a little bit about the state of things and why we need ERGs. So on that note, I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I know that we're running a little bit out of time, so if we don't have time to fully kind of answer this question, just let me know, and that's okay, or if you can go a couple minutes over. But what I'd love to hear more about is, so we've established our ERG. We know the kinds of things that we have to look at. We know we got to create space and boundaries. But how can we make sure that we are creating the kind of balance and focus that helps us to stay on track to keep the ERG healthy?
Yeah. So that balancing act of affinity building, relationship building, affinity, I'll say them together, affinity, advocacy, and professional development, I'd say are the trifecta of building that healthy, transformative ERG. Because when we have built into how we function as an ERG, the fact that our relationships are at the core, we're thinking about what we're working towards and advocating for, and thinking about what we need to be nourished with in order to do that advocacy work and in order to build that community, we can grow together in this process. And it can feel really holistic and less, I show up to this meeting and I get more work and I don't have time for more work. I show up to this meeting, I feel nourished. I'm excited about what we're going to advocate for. And I know that this sort of professional development is coming our way, and I'm excited of what that learning is going to be, because it's going to help me in that advocacy and in that community building effort.
Yeah, what I learned in grad school and beyond is that the core equity opportunities are really knowledge, communication, and relationships. And what I see so often is people forget that relational piece, But just think about it. Like, if we're not connecting with one another, then why would I change my beliefs or how I think about things? Like, it's not connecting to my humanity. But and that's kind of what's at play here. It's very, very easy for us to dehumanize one another, to dehumanize ourselves in the course of being busy. And so we got to be intentional about that. Let's see. Well, I see that we're almost out of time here, but do you have any kind of like quick success stories that you could share with us so that people can know what to expect after they kind of think about how they want to do their ERGs and after they get on the wait list for your incredible toolkit?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. The success stories, of course, we could do a whole nother episode on this, but it's organizations, I've seen whole cultural shifts within organizations. I have seen um, advocacy that's changed like gatekeeping models and that have kept people out, and now those people are invited in. So we've gotten rid of, a test, or we've gotten rid of we've changed how we do our interview process. We are more transparent in making sure people are prepared for what they're showing up for, not being tested on what they're showing up for. I've seen policy change within organizations around healthcare, around language, around parental leave, around the types of benefits that people need. And I've seen a huge shift in people connecting to each other, feeling connected to their colleagues, feeling excited about what they have to offer, being able to pay speakers to come and share their knowledge. And getting access to that kind of professional development, that mentorship, that meaning making that we need to feel really respected and valued in our place of work. And that's been really powerful. When they've been set up to be transformative, we see that they're connected to power, that they're connected to money within our organization, and they're connected to really being able to make those shifts and changes that we've asked them to make, that they are created to be a part of making.
Nice. Well, I'm very excited to see what's in this ERG toolkit. I know that it is, very rich. It is very thorough, I think we can say. And if you're interested in finding out more about that toolkit, please do head to Erin-Kate-Escobar.com. That's all one word, /ERG toolkit. And if people are looking for you and your services, Erin-Kate, where can they go?
Yeah, come on down. I'm on LinkedIn. And then my website has a lot of great ways you can contact me, schedule an appointment with me. I'm going to be at the Unconference, the Reimagining Unconference in 2 weeks, August 18th. I'll put a link to that both on LinkedIn and on my website. A really exciting place where we're thinking about reimagining work in different ways, in a collaborative way, in a non-hierarchical way, and even redefining what work means. So folks can find me, LinkedIn, my website, and at future events, cool places where we're really thinking about how do we do things differently than they've always been done.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Erin-Kate. And I also want to give a shout out to the people that commented on the show and added to our discussion. So thank you so much, Jake Small, Sabrina Townsend, Lanessa Frazier, Carolyn Moselle, and Kevin Goodman as well, and Dr. Lynette Mira too. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in and spending a little bit of time with myself and Erin-Kate. And I love spending time with you, Erin-Kate. It's so much fun. I hope that you will all be very well until we see you next in a couple of weeks. And until then, take care. Bye,
Thanks
everybody.
so much. Bye.